Another thing that what I found interesting is that you talk about that time in Chile, both at the anniversary of Pinochet dictatorship, before they became the dictatorship, overthrowing Allende, Salvador Allende's government, and at the same day that the bombings took place here in this country on September 11th. You talk about a poster that was everywhere on the campus that basically said, also on September 11th, 2001, 35,615 children died of hunger. How did that hit you when you saw that, and how do you contrast that with, Americans, we make a big deal about September 11th. It certainly was a big deal, but I got to admit, one of my first instincts when it happened was, we should have a better foreign policy. We talk about being good to people in the world, but in reality, we've helped to keep a lot of people down.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the lessons that I learned being abroad during such a important time and such a traumatic time for my country here in the United States. It definitely forced me to look at the events of September 11, 2001 through the eyes of other countries. And in fact, in this case, another country that had its own tragedy on September 11, 1973. The Pinochet regime killed approximately the same number of people that died on September 11th. So for Chileans, the parallels were totally clear. And a lot of my friends and my roommates said to me, did anybody you know get hurt? No, that's great. And by the way, this is a taste your own medicine. And, it's sad and it's tragic. And that's what they said. And obviously, that's not my position. But it was really challenged me. Hearing those positions expressed challenged me to think about, well, what is it? How do we define the difference between the tragedy that happened on that day, the horrible tragedy of those attacks and those deaths, and how do we separate that from the 35,615 children that die of preventable malnutrition every day? And what's the level of responsibility that we have, those of us who, myself included, have access to so much food and throw so much food out and waste so much on a daily basis? How can we recognize that actually every day people are dying and we go on with our life as though everything's normal, and all of a sudden something happens where a few people a little closer to home die in a way that's a little more public, a little more visible, and tragic, to be sure. And all of a sudden, it changes the whole course of world history. So I think it's important to take that into consideration and try to grapple with, well, why did September 11th happen? Not to justify or rationalize, but to understand how we can prevent it in the future and how we can prevent all those children from dying on a daily basis.
Chesa Boudin, let me ask you one more question about Chile. There have been some documentaries recently about the current state of Chile and how young people relate to Salvador Allende and the Pinochet regime and the tortures that went on and the number of people that were killed. What's your sense of people's awareness of their past in a country like Chile? Here in the United States, a lot of times people don't remember last week.
Yeah.
They're looking to the future, to the next paycheck, to what's coming out in the movies. What's your sense about a sense of history among younger people in Chile and in Latin America in general?
My experience in Chile is that people are very, very connected to their history, very aware of the history. They obviously come down on different sides of it. There's multiple perspectives that you'll come across. But the people whose family members were tortured or killed or exiled by Pinochet have been shaped, and their lives will always be impacted by that. If your aunt was exiled to Sweden or to France by the Pinochet regime, then part of your identity is somebody whose family lives overseas in a random country as a result of the political decisions made by a dictator. If your father was killed by the regime, then you grew up without a father as a result of the dictatorship, which again was supported for decades by the U.S. government. So that's a reality that I think forces many Chileans, millions of Chileans, to continue to live their own history and remember it in a very vivid way. Whereas other people may have a different memory. They may have been made rich by the Pinochet regime, business deals or what have you. But it still is something that shapes their lives, and it's very, very much present. Pinochet just died about 2 years ago, and I think that is in a certain sense the closing of a chapter, and it will allow Chileans to move on from that history in some ways that are positive, and hopefully they won't forget, because it is an important defining part of Chilean history. I think throughout Latin America there's a deep sense of history, and much more so than in this country.
One of the countries I want to ask you about is, and it's in your book, there's a chapter, Crisis of Currencies, which talks about the economic crisis and the International Monetary Fund that affected Argentina. I ask you in part because not only did you go to Yale, but I have a daughter there, and she is, Casey Blue James, is headed to Argentina this summer. Tell me a little bit about Argentina and what what went on there and what someone going down there now might expect to find?
Argentina, well, I'll start with the second part of the question. Argentina is an amazing country. It's spectacularly beautiful, warm, welcoming, like much of Latin America. Buenos Aires is a very European feeling city compared to other Latin American capitals. It's a very livable city. There's great shopping. There's great restaurants. The nightlife is one of the best in the region. People love to go out late. Dinner starts around 10 p.m., and there's a huge arts and music and dance scene, and the architecture is beautiful, and there's outdoor promenades and boulevards and parks. It's a lot of fun. There's also obviously a very active political life, and in the wake of the 2001 currency crisis, which I describe in the third chapter.
In detail.
In the third chapter of my book, Gringo, I happened to be traveling through Argentina when the crisis happened, and I found myself, among other things, in a several-hour-long line to change the traveler's check into local currency, and I watched the rate get better and better and better for me as the line took its time, and I sort of kept letting people go in front of me because the rate kept ticking up. It was a really crazy thing. I happened in that case to get a couple extra pesos out of it, but it was really traumatic for the country, and it led to, or was a defining moment not just for Argentina but for all of Latin America in its shift away from neoliberalism and its shift away from U.S. imposed economic and social policies, because it had been brought about in large part by a series of neoliberal economic policies that were put in place by Harvard-educated economists and ministers of finance, by the IMF, by the World Bank advisors, and the crisis really destroyed the economy, and it practically overnight turned a huge swath of the middle class into poor and homeless. I saw children going through garbage on a scale I'd never seen before, and this in a country that had been very prosperous and had aspired to a European style of life and identity.
Let me ask you again about Argentina. It has an Italian flair, I understand.
Yep.
And that probably led to some conservative elements in the early days. One of the things, though, that I don't know about Argentina is native population. What's left of the native population? Are they a force? Are there any people left? I think of Costa Rica, where there are very few native peoples, and partly of that reason, as I understand it, was because they fought harder and they opposed the incoming of the coming of the Spanish, and they pretty much got wiped out. What's the situation in Argentina?
Argentina is often seen and understood by outsiders and even by people from Argentina as being very white and very European and very Italian, some cases German, Spanish. But the reality is, outside of Buenos Aires, that's not so much the case. Buenos Aires is a very white, very European city. But if you go to the north, up by the Bolivian border, you do have significant indigenous groups and indigenous traditions still alive and well. If you go to the south, down to Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, there are small but active and very vibrant indigenous communities. Like much of Latin America, the Spanish did wipe out huge numbers of indigenous population and groups entirely. But like other parts of the southern cone, the frontier region of the Spanish Empire down in Patagonia was a very difficult region for the Spanish to conquer and gain control over. And so some of the indigenous groups, the nomadic ones in particular, were able to hold out and still exist today in small but active groups.